Welcome to the Rise of the Maker Architects, a talk and in conversation with Tom Kundig from Olsen Kundig and Anthony Engi-Meacock from Assemble. And the premise for this evening's lecture was, is there currency in the term Maker Architect? And if so, why is the term now relevant? And what does it mean and how did it arrive? And importantly, are we all Maker Architects now? Or is this an emerging discipline? And if so, if it is an emerging discipline, does it have a new language? Is there a language that's emerging and a new phrases that we can use to describe what we do? Through understanding authorship, that our role as architects in authoring projects, how it differs from the traditional role of the architect, and how we apply new research methods into, through, and by design, as Chris Frading would say when talking about reflective practice in architecture. So is there a new language? Are there new terms for the customization? Tom Kundig will talk a bit more about some of the phrases he uses for his work. He uses a nice phrase called hot rodding, where he talks about hot rodding buildings. And then also Anthony will also expand a little bit on exactly the role of alternative practice. So how an architect has, the architect is no longer the iconic leader of a project, but the role of the architect has kind of devolved and assumed a role of co-authorship and co-design and cooperation with alternative disciplines. And that's essentially given a rise to new phrases like pop-up architecture, meanwhile projects. And again, that's something that's happened in the last 10 years. So it sort of came out of the discussion, and we thought, well, given that Anthony and 5 members of Assemble are RCA graduates, we thought this was a place to start the discussion. So this evening, it's going to be we're going to do both guests are going to give their presentations, and then we're going to have an in-conversation discussion around the table, which we'd like to share with the audience to sort of just test out and tease this idea of the Maker Architect. So I'll just introduce both guests. So Anthony is a founding member of Assemble. Assemble are a multidisciplinary collective working across architecture, design and art. Founded in 2010 to undertake a single self-built project, Assemble has since delivered a diverse and award-winning body of work whilst retaining a democratic and cooperative working method that enables built, social and research-based work at a variety of scales, both making things and making things happen. And he didn't put in the bio, but he obviously Assemble are winners of the Tate Turner Prize this year, so congratulations. Tom Kundig, principal owner, Olsen Kundig. Tom is a principal, over the past 3 decades, Tom has received some of the world's highest design honours, from the National Design Award from the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum to an Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2014, Tom was included in Architectural Digest AD 100. In 2012, he was inducted into Interior Design Magazine's Hall of Fame. And his current work is found on 5 continents, including a World Heritage Site in Dachstein, Austria. Tom is a frequent guest and speaker at universities and conferences throughout the US and abroad. He has held chairs and guest critic positions at the University of Southern California, Syracuse University, Harvard University, among others, and served as the John G. Williams Distinguished Professor at the Fay Jones School of Architecture and the University of Arkansas. So let me first, so if I ask you all to join me in welcoming the first guest, Anthony, to come up and talk about their work. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is Assemble, well, sort of some of Assemble. We're intentionally sort of fluid in numbers. I'm going to start with a slightly provocative quote, which I think should, the talk I've put together is more about, sort of setting up some questions, hopefully that the Q&A can answer later, rather than kind of expanding massively what we do. But creativity is for the gifted few. The rest of us are compelled to live in the environments constructed by the gifted few. Listen to the gifted few's music, use the gifted few's inventions in art, and read the poems, the stories, and the plays by the gifted few. This is what our education and culture conditions us to believe, and is a culturally induced and perpetuated lie. So I think it's kind of an interesting quote to start with, in that the idea that the kind of traditional mode of architecture is really one that's imposed from above, and this kind of very top-down imposition into the cities, and that somehow you solve problems and you solve solutions, and you're this kind of heroic figure, sort of Randian figure. And I think it's sort of what the kind of introduction hinted at, and what our kind of work has been about is a kind of thinking a way around that in a kind of very different way, in that the architecture is far more a participant in an ongoing process of a small cog, an essential cog, but a small cog in a much bigger system. And so I'm going to talk through kind of our creation myth initially, just kind of get that over with, and then talk about two kind of live projects that I think explain some of the interests in how this sort of way of working works, but also some of the drawbacks, some of the problems that kind of collaborative working works, and like how it's intrinsically quite, it involves an element of conflict that I guess is often tries to be excluded from practice. So as Adrian said, we were started in 2010 to sort of accidentally to form the Cinerolium, which was a project that we, I guess, emerged out of a disquiet with working in as a part one. And I just remember going to work and feeling like you were making the world actively worse by drawing on these kind of extremely dull projects, that small, horrible boxes that people get to live in. And a kind of resentment of that type of way of working, and feeling that there must be a kind of more fulfilling way of working. And it really, I guess, we emerged out this project as much as this project emerged out of us. And then through working together, we negotiated a system working that's kind of really stuck with us for the rest of our well, very short career so far. The year after that evolved into the Folly for a Flyover, and that, I guess, if the Cinerolium was fundamentally selfish in a way, it was about us testing our own ideas out, and we didn't think we had a real platform as such. The Folly was the first time we thought we had some sort of broader platform, and it was a chance to to test out some of the ideas and some of the working methods we'd evolved, but still essentially self-build, still essentially self-initiated. But kind of invite more people in and make it more of a public space. From there, we were invited to do our first kind of built work, which was a slightly naive attempt in bringing those ideas kind of wholesale into the centre of Croydon. And it sort of half worked, half not, but I guess it was our first reality check in terms of how the idea that how much energy it requires to really get people to buy into a project you're doing. And this project kind of really worked while we were there kind of pushing it. But and while it sort of still looks good, it still sort of serves its function, it's kind of the anticipation that we thought it might really kind of change the way people use the street just hasn't borne out. And then alongside that, we've sort of gained a home, a sort of permanent home, which is still our kind of working base. Sugar House Studios, where we've kind of got assembled our sort of toy box of stuff. And that's really served like a constant place of experimentation. And slowly over time, we've invited more people to work with us there. And informed way of working, it's really about both design and thinking, and also making hands-on, and that kind of directly translated to our kind of sort of ongoing interest in workspaces, how people work together, and providing space that people collaborate work. This is an image of Black Horse Workshop, which is currently running, and kind of one of our first examples of setting up an organisation as an intrinsic part of a project, that the project is more than the building. Actually, this will probably be, my bit at least, will be an architecture talk that's very light on architecture as such. The kind of space is made up by all the components that go into it, the activity, the things, and sometimes the designers knowing when to step back and actually just let things be, and those kind of little moments make things really special. So this is sort of the evolution of Sugar House into kind of a kind of co-working space and our current home. We are now kind of 5 years in, due to be kicked out at the hand of a developer. This is always part of the deal, so it's not sort of that brutal. And so we're actively touting for a new home. So if anyone has a large plot of land for free they'd like to give us, we'd really like that. But I guess what this says is like kind of how we've come, kind of how we've evolved from a kind of slightly, I guess slightly naive, but very kind of well-intended, to something that feels like we're starting to work out exactly how we kind of feel we can affect and fit into the world in larger scale. I guess central through all that work is the idea that working with people and giving people the agency to shape their own lives and shape their own lives in the city is fundamentally important, getting them to buy into what you're doing, and that where a lot of kind of well-intended social and architectural design falls down is that it's imposed, and at no point do you treat the people you're working with as participants. And they have an agency, which means they either buy into it and like it, or they don't like it, but they treat them as customers. And I think this is quite a good quote that kind of sums up what's wrong with our current attitude of cities. The freedom to make and remark ourselves and our cities is, I want to argue, one of the most precious and yet most neglected of our human rights. And I think the next 2 projects, which are sort of the ones that are kind of still active going on, kind of explain how we feel that fits in. I think David Harvey's all interesting, but slightly overly Marxist at times, so I think it's a really good example from him. Baltic Street Adventure Playground was one of our projects, an arts commission. We were invited in by Create, who were sort of helping run the sort of competition. And what we, I guess, slowly over time discussed how what Glasgow really didn't need was a sculpture on a roundabout. This was an arts commission that was centred around the Commonwealth Games, and which is in the east end of Glasgow, a situation where a lot of the current play provision looks like this. This is our site before we got there, and that was the only playground in the area that was demolished to make way for a community centre that never emerged. And the idea that there's an intent and there's a kind of hope in the area that they are going to redevelop it, but those timescales are involved sort of 10, 15, 20, 30 years, which to an adult is long, but to a child is a kind of entire lifetime. And that instead of kind of using, again, that's acting with sort of hat of artist on, that you could redivert some of that money into a project that kind of both was sort of artful in design, but also was a real social value. And I guess parallel to this, and something that probably a lot of our upbringings had behind it, was the idea of kind of play and adventure play and kind of messy play and risk in play, and how important that the kind of act of self-creation that a child goes through is fundamental to your of gaining understanding how you live in a city. And this is the idea that really kind of emerged out of the rubble of the Second World War and felt quite appropriate in an area that the most kind of visible effect of modernisation in this area of Glasgow has been demolition. And the sort of promised rebuilding hasn't really emerged yet. And I guess it's a sort of really nice image of Crawley, I think Crawley Wood Adventure Playground in 1955, showing the idea of like sort of children really being allowed to make their own space and define their own space, and in doing so, you kind of forced to make decisions and really learn how your agency and how you act in the world. And this started with the idea that actually what was needed to play was not playground equipment, slides, swings, but space, a state of exception that allowed children to play in a way that's previously excluded from most of the city. And so our first move was to essentially make the site safe, and for 2 weeks over October 2013, I think, or 2014, 2013, God, a while ago now, to run it kind of as a test bed for play. And this is a mud fight that emerged. And the idea being that actually the space that doesn't look particularly pretty or particularly attractive to adults is incredibly valuable as an opportunity for them to kind of explore. And alongside that, kind of run a political campaign in Glasgow, and this was part of Glasgow International, which is a big arts festival there. And again, I guess there's a good quote from Myers Mickelson about art is doing politics, and the act of art is creating something in the world that intersects with or between kind of creation and politics. And I think that's something that a lot of us subscribe to. But this was like bringing the playground outside its kind of safe wall, which is generally down to legislature rather than desire, and inserting this kind of loose play, messy play in the middle of one of the biggest public parks in Glasgow, which is the People's Park. And in doing so, trying to show how actually this type of risky play, or play that's associated with risk, generally is actually not that risky at all. And over the whole weekend, we had 2 or 3 staff that were kind of us. But really, we didn't have to do anything. It was just our presence there was to enable us to be able to do it. But actually, the kids, we had not a single injury, no fights, nothing. And it's about only stepping in when you really needed to. And that evolved, again, alongside this kind of, into a kind of final form of the playground that essentially consists of a fence, a nice timber fence, that allows us to kind of exist outside the normal health and safety legislation that's placed on playgrounds, and create a space that's for children. And really the only rule is you're allowed to play as ever you see fit, but you're not allowed to play in any way that prevents another child from playing how they want to play. And you can see how kind of most of their societal kind of structures can kind of come from that quite simple rule. And then alongside the kind of creation of space is creating equipment that enables children to play and own it. So one of the biggest barriers there was that none of them own suitable outdoor clothes, and so they go home muddy and they get shouted at by their parents. So something as simple as providing boots and providing waterproof jackets kind of breaks down that kind of central barrier. And this world of kind of playing, so there's a kind of, again, the kind of playground is very loose. They come and they choose what to do, and this world of sort of mixture of playing kind of any objects they find, their agency to change and adapt and kind of make decisions about the way they want the space to look, and kind of get hands-on with building. And I guess something that, this is a child that by their school had defined as dangerous, risky, like fight, who's some people with ADHD or autism, something like that. And actually, mainly what's happened is he didn't have the, wasn't ever given the trust to kind of, to like behave, for want of a better word. And so like actually, by giving him the agency to look after the space for himself, he now is kind of perfectly well behaved. He cleans. They all clean the play. It's not just him. This is sort of something that applies to a lot of them. They all clean the playground themselves. They sort things out and they discuss things themselves. And it actually, intervention-wise, is really very minimal from the sort of play workers. And this is a project that's really kind of incredibly indebted to the people who've worked within Glasgow and the play workers found there, and who have really kind of, I think something that's common in lots of our projects, that it's like we come in and do bits, but actually the kind of main drive as often comes from working with kind of really amazing people. And so this is currently still a kind of ongoing thing, and I guess we're still involved on a kind of organizational level, and the battle here is trying to maintain a funding stream where the kind of initial funding from the art grant has dried up, and this kind of constant battle with the sort of local council trying to kind of give it a sustainable future. But the end result is kind of quite extraordinary space that really does feel like it belongs to the kids who are there, and that's the thing that makes it really satisfying. But that doesn't conform to like norms of what architecture or good architecture or beautiful architecture looks like on an adult perspective. And I guess this kind of leads to another sort of little quote that's about, again, more probably about discussion than about any particular point. But this is a quote from Marcus Meeson in a book called The Nightmare of Participation that's all about essentially a destruction of the idea of collaboration. And his argument is mainly what you do is when you think you collaborate is you're not really collaborating. What you're doing is imposing your decisions, and you're avoiding risk, and you're using collaboration as a way of getting that. And so most consultancy processes in architecture are fake. You know, you go in and you ask questions that you know the answer to, and then you submit that to planning, and then you get your planning, and that's it. And actually, it's sort of fine. They serve purpose, but they're not collaboration. And his argument is that to really collaborate means you have to take a risk. And the risk means that you don't know the result when you start. I think both the playground and this next project, when I'm talking about Liverpool, kind of sum up that attitude that when you get into something, and actually sometimes the biggest value of anything you can do is just go and listen. And so coming into Liverpool, which I guess the sort of project was mainly cited with the Turner Prize, this area of Liverpool called Toxteth, which is centred around Granby Street, is 4 of the last surviving Victorian terraces in the area. And most of the rest of the terraces were sort of demolished in the process after the riots, which the local area quite referred to an uprising. And I don't know if most people know about them, but basically it was started up when the police essentially beat up a black youth who they accused of stealing a scooter. And after it emerged that the scooter was his brother's, and he was like telling the truth the whole time, and that provided a flashpoint for kind of a seething resentment against kind of a political elite that felt like wasn't really dealing with them at all. And the end result of that was a kind of consistent process of managed decline under Heseltine that really kind of let the area run down, and the way of kind of, in some ways it reflects a lot what happened in the bit of Glasgow working at. In a way of combating the violence was just to break up the area, and so you just kind of destroy its spirit, which did destroy did end the violence, but only by moving everyone else out of it, and doesn't really fix the underlying social problems. Instead of kind of going more into social history, I'm going to read a bit of a poem by one of the residents there, because I feel we're not social historians, and it's not really what we're good at. And I think this is a woman called Hazel Tilley, who's lived there from that moment till now, and is a kind of amazing woman who's a mental health nurse, and has kind of battled and fought and kind of worked with it. There's a kind of cluster of them who still live there. And it feels like her voice is much better than mine at kind of explaining what they've done and why it's so amazing, and kind of why it's such a humbling experience to go into Liverpool and work with them. So houses are knocked down because someone who never walked down Granby Street knows how to improve our area and the best way for us to live. And people are moved out because the shops are closed down and the area is neglected, and other people, the ones who know the best way for us to live, smell money. So they ignore the history of each brick and slate and skirting board, of each life spent in each house. They interfere with the little lives of little people who don't know the best way to live. They neglect how each house and life and family and how each street came together. And the people who know the best way for us to live remove the lead from the roofs of the houses they empty to stop it from being stripped and stolen and sold by us who don't know the best way for us to live. So we can't buy drink and drugs or heating or food or pay our bedroom tax or buy a present for those we love, who also don't know the best way for us to live. And money and ideas and promises change hands between the people who know the best ways for us to live and the people they consult, because they too, the expensively useless consultants, know the best ways for us to live. Listen up. You don't know the best ways for us to live, and you don't share our values. You who think you know the best way for us to live, who squabble over the bones of power and pose for the smell of money, who can't imagine the way we want to live and whose values are such they can't be shared with our values. You don't know the best way to live. You moved people who didn't want to move. You try to close us up and sweep us into corners. You saw a big picture and a whole solution where we saw messy and we experienced variety in home and life. And when you couldn't shut us down, you left us, the people who don't know the best way to live. With the rain penetrating our roofs and our floorboards weeping, you, with the talk of the world in one city, break up the heart of it and leave its history to crumble. And we don't go away, and bit by bit we reclaim our streets. You don't help. You can't think small enough to know what to do with people in their messy, organic, piecemeal lives, with dreams and values, and who have found a way to live. And in a messy and piecemeal way, the rain stops penetrating the houses, and the weeping floorboards are comforted, and people move in, and the street lights up, and sometimes on Wednesday, the bin men drive round. And nobody gave much thought to where we keep the bins, not even you, the lots and lots of you who know the best way for us to live. And what are the bins you hear? What are the bins I hear you say? Well, that's another rant for another day. I think what that really kind of beautifully sums up is how they really feel that they've been kind of subject to a whole series of kind of big, potentially well-intentioned solutions, but that at no point took any account of how they've been living their lives and how they've been managing their lives quite well. And a kind of final act of desperation in a way, they started changing the houses opposite them. And this is an example of where they painted, they decorated, and they planted. The idea being they didn't, the street looked shit, wasn't looked after, it had been abandoned. They're sick of looking at empty houses, and the first way of doing that is just to paint the empty houses so they look less empty. And the street was unloved, and kind of the bins didn't bother getting swept up. And so the way of dealing with that was to plant the street up themselves. And in these kind of small act of rebellion, in a way, they kind of reclaimed ownership of their street. And in doing so, also reclaimed their community. And this is the moment where we kind of stepped in, kind of incredibly fortuitously, working in the area on another project. And it just seemed very obvious that their way of thinking about cities and our way of thinking sort of shared a lot in common. And they were they'd just gained a whole chunk of funding from the Nationwide Trust, and had also gained the council has, to its credit, realised the sort of failures of that previous model. And in doing so, had granted 10 houses to the council, 10 houses to the CLT, which they then became, to refurbish. And so they were looking for an architect, but had had a series of very bad experiences with sort of top-down architects who turn up in a suit and tell them what's wrong and then disappear when the sort of project dries up. And so we started by looking at the condition of the houses that were there, and we started by listening to them and talking to them. And then by learning for the houses that they lived in, and these are sort of two photos of the houses that they've kind of moved in, and the sort of small adaptations they've made to these kind of very simple, very kind of shell-like houses to make them home. And looking at how, with incredibly minimal budget, I think each house had a budget of £75,000 or something to refurbish it, which is a lot lower than even the local council was paying on them. What you keep standard and what moments of specialness, what moments of home you bring in. And the idea that you can start making these objects that really bring together and make a home feel home. So this sort of centered around the hearth as one of these objects, which has a kind of deep psychological meaning. And then kind of came up with this process of reconstituting some of the rubble into Granby rock, which became the mantelpieces that each home has and the worktop that each home has. And I guess that learning experience is sort of that idea of how the ability of small actions, a small piece of design, a small kind of that little extra 5% that makes something special, led on to Granby Workshop. And Granby Workshop is a kind of ongoing project, kind of the idea that a place to live is not just about residential space. It's also about kind of a functional city has accommodation. It also has commercial life, and a way of again, this is an area where all the shops have been forced out. There's no kind of business anymore, and of kind of starting a very small enterprise, social enterprise that could start providing employment, but also provide people who are moving in and the agency to kind of decorate their own homes, so that the homes would both be decorated with some of the objects from there, but they also provide a resource for them to come and learn and explore, and a kind of an outlet, well, hopefully also providing a source of income. This is a sort of example of a kind of smoke-fired ceramic door handle. And these kind of objects were assembled into the exhibition that was on at the Tramway and the Turner Prize. And the idea being that if the Turner Prize is going to kind of use us in a way, not in a kind of vindictive way, but sort of use us as a way of reinvigorating it, we can also use it as a way of promoting our agenda. And the idea that what we're not good at is social history or anything like that, and what we are good at is doing projects. And we felt really uncomfortable with the idea that somehow we were saving this area and that's what we should be showing at the Turner Prize. And actually, because that's not true, they've saved the area, and we've provided a very important little push here and there, but it's not. The 99% is not us. And so instead, it seemed like the what we should do is do what we do well, which is the project. And so that project became the Grammar Workshop. And I think this is a sort of quote again, something that someone who was brought up earlier today, sort of Fester Gates, who I think is interesting, but also kind of conflicted, which is make the thing that makes a thing. The idea being that by making the thing that in itself can be used as a tool, you actually do far more than kind of making a very beautiful object that's kind of fundamentally useless. Where I sort of think this quote falls down a bit is it kind of opts you out of the success or failure of the thing in itself, which is problematic. And alongside that, the idea that making art is making choices, and that the act of creation in itself, so this comes from Black Mountain College, or Black Mountain School, depending which way you phrase it, which was a kind of really amazing art school in America, that seemingly everyone involved in kind of the sort of mid-century modernism art movement had some involvement with, and most kind of contemporary. And the idea that the act of creation itself, you are forced you to make decisions. No one can write the poem for you. No one can make the piece of art for you. And by doing so, you kind of learn your space in the world. And then kind of all these projects, I guess, have a common line of this idea of agency. And finally, doing art is doing politics, I guess, is the kind of end kind of piece to sort of end on in that. The idea that that creative process in itself is a deeply political act. And I guess these are kind of quotes also slightly preempting some of the questions about is it art or is it not art? And I think the fundamental answer, it doesn't matter if it's art. Art is like the framework that you view it with and how it intersects kind of the rest of the world. And I think, hopefully, these open up a few questions about discussion later about the nature of creative practice and the value of creative practice in kind of making cities and making places and how the architect then fits into that kind of broader creative practice. This is my end pitch.